So we'll go ahead and get started. All right, good morning. Welcome to the hearings of the International Commission of Inquiry on Systemic Racist Police Violence Against People of African Descent in the United States. These hearings are a process by which witnesses can present accounts of unjustified killings and maimings of Black people by police in the United States before an international panel of human rights experts. We will now begin the hearing in the case of Tyrone West. My name is Priscilla Ocen, and I am the rapporteur for this meeting. Presiding over this hearing is Commissioner Sir Clare Roberts of Antigua and Commissioner Hannibal Uwaifo of Nigeria. The witnesses for today's hearing are Nana Gyamfi, Chris Lawrence, Jasmine Smith, and Tawanda Jones. There will be 15 minutes allocated for this hearing. Witnesses will testify, followed by a period of questions for commissioners. I will call time at 30 minutes and 45 minutes, so please excuse any interruptions that may occur. Commissioners Roberts and Uwaifo, I now present you our first witness, Nana Gyamfi. Ms. Gyamfi, please confirm your name.
Nana Gyamfi.
Do you promise that your testimony to the Commission of Inquiry will be true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes, I do.
Please proceed.
Thank you. Good morning and good afternoon, commissioners. Thank you, Professor Ocen. Thank you, Steering Committee and Commission, for the opportunity to testify about the matter of Tyrone West. I'm not the attorney who brought the case, but I want to share the basic facts of the case with you as efficiently as possible so that we can hear from Ms. Jones about her journey for justice for her brother. On July 18th, 2013, the Baltimore Police Department took the life of Mr. West, a 44-year-old grandfather, father, brother, and beloved community member. That evening, Mr. West, who operated a community ride service, was giving one of his neighbors, Miss S, a ride to work. While driving an unmarked vehicle, two Baltimore Police Department officers, Jorge Omar Bernandez Ruiz and Nicholas Chapman, began to follow the car driven by Mr. West. Police reports claimed that Mr. West committed a traffic violation while backing up the vehicle. Civilian eyewitnesses indicate that Mr. West did not commit a traffic violation, that in fact, he merely stopped his car briefly and then continued driving. While following Mr. West, officers claimed that they observed a suspicious activity by Mr. West and his passengers, in which they claimed the two were moving around like they were trying to hand something off to each other. After following Mr. West for a short period, the officers initiated a traffic stop. Because the police were in an unmarked car, some civilian witnesses initially believed the police, who approached the vehicle with weapons drawn, were attempting to rob Mr. West and his passenger. The police repeatedly asked Mr. West or Miss S if they had drugs or weapons in the car. The two denied it. The two officers directed Mr. West and Miss C to exit the vehicle and sit on the curb. Police reports indicate that Mr. West and Miss S complied. However, the family of Miss West and their attorneys later received conflicting reports from eyewitnesses that indicated the officer's initial contact with Mr. West was much more violent and much more abusive. Witnesses indicated that Officer Chapman reached into the car and pulled Mr. West out by his dreadlocks. Mr. West was heard screaming, "Ouch, get off of my hair," as he was pulled to the ground. Witnesses report also that the Officer Chapman said, "This is what we do to you," using an expletive and N-words, and that his colleague Bernandez Ruiz agreed and told Mr. West to get the F on the ground and tased him as many as 4 times on his neck. Despite lacking consent or probable cause to search the interior of Mr. West's vehicle for drugs or weapons, Officer Chapman searched the vehicle and found nothing. The officers requested permission, according to them, to search the trunk of the vehicle. And according to the officers, they received permission from Mr. West and searched the trunk. However, witnesses reported that Mr. West refused to permit a search of the trunk and indicated that the vehicle belonged to his sister, which was true. Officers found nothing. There are conflicting reports from the police on whether Mr. West was wearing short pants or rolled his pant legs up past his ankles as he sat on the ground. Officer Bernandez Ruiz claimed he observed a golf ball-sized object in Mr. West's sock. He claimed that Mr. West brushed his hand away when the officer reached toward his foot. Officers responded, according to witnesses, by grabbing Mr. West and attempting to arrest him as he was on the ground. Ms. S testified in her deposition in this case that as Mr. West attempted to stand, the officers rolled him over on his backside and then got him over on his stomach. She added that the white policeman put his left knee at the back of Mr. West. While West was on his stomach, the officers directly pepper sprayed him several times in his face and neck. In reaction to the spray, Mr. West screamed and tried to stand up, throwing Officer Chapman off of him and Officer Bernandez Ruiz falling into the police car. Community witnesses described Mr. West's actions as those of a man defending himself for his life and seeking relief from the assault he was experiencing from Officers Bernandez Ruiz and Officer Chapman. Officer Bernandez Ruiz was beating Mr. West. Officer Chapman joined Bernandez Ruiz in beating Mr. West. Then, and while continuing to beat Mr. West, Officer Bernandez Ruiz sent a radio request for backup. Using their fists and batons, the officers continued to beat Mr. West, who was defending himself from the assault by attempting to block and avoid their blows, according to witnesses. All reports indicate that Mr. West was able to briefly get free from the assault and ran with his hands in the air, screaming, "Trayvon Martin, Trayvon Martin." As the police caught up to Mr. West, he laid face down on the ground with his arms spread out. The officers resumed beating Mr. West with their batons as he lay in this position, hitting him everywhere, head, body, back, everywhere, according to Ms. S. She said they were just hitting him. According to Ms. S, Mr. West had one cuff on his right hand, but the other was dangling free, and the officers did not attempt to link the handcuffs while Mr. West was on the ground. Instead, they continued to beat and hit him with their batons. According to other eyewitnesses, Mr. West, in an attempt to defend himself, tried again to stand up and to move his arms around in a defensive manner. At this time, other officers began to arrive. Eventually, there were about 10 to 25 officers on the scene. Reports indicate that at least 7 of the officers, began to beat Mr. West with their fists and batons, including on his head, as he stood with his back against a nearby large SUV. After enduring this brutal assault, Mr. West collapsed on the sidewalk. And then at least 4 officers began stomping him with their boots on Mr. West's upper body while he was laying on his back. Eventually, the officers handcuffed Mr. West. Now, police claim that while Mr. West was on his stomach, Officer David Lewis placed his knee on Mr. West's back for about a minute. A nearby officer suspected Mr. West had stopped breathing and asked an unidentified officer to help turn over Mr. West's body. According to police, at about the same time, another officer arrived and made efforts to resuscitate Mr. West, who was not breathing and did not have a discernible pulse. However, community reports materially conflict with these accounts from the police. Instead, community accounts indicate that Officer Lewis stood on Mr. West's back and neck for over 5 minutes while Mr. West was restrained on the ground. Officers circled Mr. West to prevent witnesses from observing all of the actions of the police. Paramedics' testimony indicates that they were not called to the scene for Mr. West, but called to the scene for Officer Chapman, who had sprayed so many chemicals and pepper spray that he got, and Mr. Ruiz got pepper spray in their own eyes. Witnesses at the scene indicate that they had to tell paramedics to check on Mr. West. They also said it took 35 to 45 minutes before paramedics got Mr. West in the ambulance and left for the hospital. The family brought suit against several officers, the city and the state of Maryland, for violations of 42 USC 1983, for violations of US Constitution and the Maryland Constitution. The city of Baltimore and the state of Maryland settled with the family for $1 million. Tyrone West should be alive today. His killing was inhumane and unconscionable. As you hear the rest of the testimony in this case, you'll hear familiar themes regarding the lack of police accountability and the resultant impunity. Officers with multiple complaints of violence against Black people who receive no discipline. The failure on the part of the police to make sure Mr. West received medical aid. The efforts by the state to blame the victim of police violence for his own death. And the collusion between the coroner and police in ruling on the cause of death when the police kill. With the commissioner's permission, I hope to provide more information on these issues of accountability and impunity after Ms. Jones testifies. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Gyamfi. We will now, Commissioners Roberts and Uwaifo, I now present to you our next witness, Christopher Lawrence. Mr. Lawrence, please confirm your name.
Christopher Lawrence.
Do you promise that your testimony to the Commission of Inquiry will be true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
I do.
Please proceed.
Good morning, Commissioners, and thank you for allowing me to speak today. The statistics I will be discussing shortly were obtained from a recent Maryland ACU report on police violence. We provided a copy of the report to the Commissioners earlier this week. Commissioners, there is a clear disparity between how Maryland, the City of Baltimore, and its associated police departments treat its white citizens and Black citizens. I want to share a couple statistics which I believe will illustrate this point. In the state of Maryland, Black people make up slightly less than 1/3 of the population. Yet year over year, Black citizens account for approximately half of all traffic stops, over half of the jail population, and nearly 3/4 of the state's prison population. If we look closer at the City of Baltimore specifically, Black residents account for approximately 63% of Baltimore City's population, but they account for over 90% of all citizens against whom officers use force. White residents account for only 7.3% of the use of force arrests. Between 2010 and 2016, 63% of the citizens killed by police in Maryland were Black. This is the second highest percentage of Black killings by police in the United States, second only to Washington, D.C. Some may argue that these uses of force are the result of police officers' need to protect the community from violent criminals. However, once again, the data demonstrates a contradicting truth. Many of the use of force arrests are for low-level nonviolent charges. According to the data compiled by the Maryland ACU, controlled substance violations and traffic violations accounted for over 1/4 of all use of force arrests. But this conduct has not gone unnoticed by the residents of Baltimore. Between 2015 and 2019, the Baltimore Police Department received over 13,000 complaints of misconduct against their officers. And this includes the 18 complaints filed against Officer Ruiz in this case. However, despite the large number of complaints, very few of them, which are made by Black residents, are actually sustained. Black residents account for 73% of all total complaints, but yet only 7% of those complaints are sustained. I believe it is clear that there are two police forces in Baltimore, one for its Black residents and one for its white residents. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Lawrence. Commissioners Roberts and Uwaifo, I present to you our next witness, Jasmine Smith. Ms. Smith, can you confirm your name, please?
Yes, Jasmine Smith.
And do you promise that your testimony will be true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes.
Please proceed with your testimony.
All right. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, commissioners, for allowing me to speak here today. I'm going to present a bit of background research on corruption within the Baltimore Police Department and some of the plainclothes policing that takes place in the Baltimore Police Department. So at the time Mr. West was killed by Baltimore Police Department, they had a task force called Gun Trace Task Force, whose mission was purportedly to take guns off the streets of Baltimore. However, between 2017 and 2019, several members of the task force were tried and convicted of crimes that included racketeering, robbery, extortion, overtime fraud, and selling drugs during police operations by the Department of Justice. According to a 2021 report by the Maryland American Civil Liberties Union, the leader of this task force, Sergeant Wayne Jenkins, received 227 complaints between 2015 and 2019. 3 other members of the task force received between 40 and 47 complaints each between 2015 and 2017 prior to the indictments. The task force was disbanded, but other plainclothes units have either been permitted to continue functioning or have been newly created, such as district action teams and anti-crime section. Even as there continue to be the same allegations of violence and misconduct, Baltimore Police Department has continued to staff these specialized units with corrupt and violent officers.
Thank you very much, Ms. Smith. Commissioners, our next witness is Ms. Tawanda Jones. Ms. Jones, can you confirm your name, please?
Yes, my name is Tawanda Jones.
Thank you. And do you promise that your testimony will be true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Absolutely, yes.
Please proceed with your testimony, Ms. Jones.
Okay, so first of all, I want to thank everybody. Just thank you so much for making me a part of this to uplift my brother Tyrone West's name, as well as his story, his legacy. So my name is Tawanda Jones. I am the sister of Tyrone West, and I just wanted to clear one thing up. When Miss Nana had said that my brother was like a community driver, you know, he wasn't a community driver. I think that was more so the narrative that the police and the media put out, because they try to say that my brother did hacking. Hacking is like basically illegal cab driving. You don't have your license, but you just drive. But that wasn't the case at all. My brother actually worked for a warehouse that basically set up and distribute furniture, office furniture and whatnot. So he was, you know, he did that. That was his living, and he helped with my family as well. But just thank you. I just wanted to clear that up. But just real quickly, so that day on July the 18th, 2013, it changed my family life forever. Like, we never asked to be in this. It literally what went from a beautiful day of spending time with my big brother and him watching over my family, him making sure my grandmother, that's 88 years old now this day, but at the time, you know, going on 8 years ago, she was like 79, going on 8 or whatever. But nevertheless, he made sure she exercised. He believed in, you know, just taking care of herself. And our king was just brutally murdered by 11 to 15, you know, killer cops. And I'm going to call a spade killer cops. And the saddest part, that the officer that Miss Nana basically put out there through weeks, you know, he is a repeat violent offender. Let's be crystal clear. He worked with the Gun Trace Task Force. And to me, their job was basically targeting Black men and women in the community, that if you had a nice type of car, they would just basically stereotype you with these implicit bias and whatnot, that you're a drug dealer, that, you know, you're doing something wrong. And the only thing my brother was doing that day was giving the lady, Miss S, a ride. She asked for a ride, literally. He had just worked all day and he picked me up. I called myself letting him borrow my vehicle that I thought was going to be safe. And he, you know, picked her up, and from that moment he was executed. And I remember the last conversation me and him had, and it's so touchy when I heard Miss Nana describe that the witnesses said he was screaming out, Trayvon Martin, help, because before he pulled off, we had a conversation about George Zimmerman, you know, who murdered unarmed Trayvon Martin. You know, even though George Zimmerman was to me a vigilante, you know, but nevertheless, you know, that didn't set well on me and my brother's heart. You know, that had just happened, you know, that Saturday prior to that Thursday when my brother was executed. And he said, sis, we need to worry about all the George Zimmermans in our community. And I never knew what he meant until actually he was murdered. So this has took a totality on my family, because we don't understand why he was murdered. But as it goes on, I clearly understand. You know, it's hard with American skin in a murder case. You know, they don't care about us, because if you can murder anyone and get away with it, get away with taking a precious life, and nobody gets held accountable, that's a big problem. And that's what it is. It's legalized genocide. They've been doing this as a history of police. And remember, police were slave catchers. So we want to talk about this whole corrupt system that has us enslaved for nearly 400 years. We must think about all the corruption that goes along with this. It's not just only the police officers involved in my brother's case. We got to talk about the medical examiner's office, who basically literally let my family down. It took them 154 days to put out a partial report, you know, stating that my brother died from a heart attack and dehydration due to the hot weather. What about the armed men and women that beat, stomped, pepper sprayed, tased, kicked my brother? You know, beat him from one side of the street to the next. What about them? Why they didn't pass out? They're dressed in all this armor gear and everything. My brother had on a white tank top and a pair of black shorts that came down to his knee. And the police officers, they can't even lie, right? See, that's the thing. The dead people can't speak. But thank God I am my brother's keeper. And I'm going to always speak up, not just for my brother Tyrone West, but for all the victims of police brutality, police terrorism. Let's be crystal clear. You know, this has been going on way too much. And for me, literally, to see families such as Tamir Rice's mother, a little baby, you know, boy playing in a playground, gunned down in seconds, literally seconds, 1 second, and nobody be held accountable. You know, why in my case should I believe in my brother, you know, an unarmed man that wasn't doing nothing but giving a young lady a ride? Why will I, in my mind, believe that these officers are going to be held accountable? There were video footage to this day through different deposition positions. We have never obtained any of the video footage. Also, just to kind of backslide, I wanted to say that, you know, just looking at the medical examiner's office report, how they basically, you know, made it seem like my brother was unhealthy and died. It took them 154 days. And their timing is immaculate, because they waited right before Christmas, when nobody's watching the news type of thing, to break my family heart. They broke my family heart like December the 22nd, something like that. People were getting ready for the holiday shop, things like that. They know exactly what they're doing. It don't take anyone 154 days to do anything. And I also want to just talk about major things and why things don't get held, people don't get held accountable. Let's talk about the Officer Bill of Rights. That's the label. We call it the label. And it was established in 1974. And basically what happens, it's a security blanket. Whereas though these officers, they don't get interrogated as if you and I was to murder someone. They get an interview. And they get an interview with their attorney literally 30 days later. And then the crazy part, they try to make it seem like, you know, they're trying to do something about this Officer Bill of Rights, because they used to be 10 days before they get brought in to give their statement or whatever, but then they knocked it down to 5. They need to get rid of it completely. They need to get rid of all these racist things that uplift this racist system. And it's an easy fix. Until we hold these killer cops in a cell block, we could talk about reform, we could talk about this and that all day long, but the biggest thing is holding these killer cops accountable. And it's just sad, like you have a bunch of people, a bunch of corruption, the medical exams, you have attorneys, and then the sad part for the police officers to lie and say, oh, well, the fight initiated when my brother sat down on the curb and they noticed a balls that when his pants leg, he had on socks and he had on ankle socks. Let's be crystal clear, ankle socks. And then out the killer's mouth through the depositions, Ruiz said when he was sworn in on the testimony, asking to give true facts. Where did you see the drugs at? I never saw the drugs. I heard about it on the news. Like, are you freaking kidding me? And then they never tested any drugs nor submitted it. But for you to have Ruiz and Chapman, the first two that started this brutal, heinous murder, beat my brother to death. Literally, I can imagine how he suffered. Like, I try to mild it down for my family, but we done been through, different changes. We started something literally, because you're not going to kill my brother and walk away. Heck no, you're not going to do that. So we started something initially and immediately, called West Wednesday. So for now, for 392 weeks, 2,747 days, I literally count down every single day. Like, you're not going to get away with murdering my brother. And the fact that Ruiz is still working with promotion, like he was promoted to sergeant. You were promoted for what? But we're actually doing work in my community, trying to be a difference maker through all our hurt and pain. I put my grief up on the shelf. Literally, and last week, my cousin just was murdered. One of the men that stood on the front line with me, protesting, screaming at my brother Tyrone West, life mattered. My cousin Tavon Anderson was brutally gunned down, and we have a serial killer, and nobody has solved his crime yet. And I feel like everybody's suspect, including Ruiz, because it's interesting. Let's be clear. The night my cousin was murdered, be clear, I was talking about that report that the brother talked about, the ACLU that came down with all the complaints on Baltimore. They interviewed me. I was talking to them about Ruiz, and I learned that day on the news that he had 18 additional complaints. Only knew about the 6, including the brutal murder of my brother. And what about the men and women that are too afraid to go down and trust officers to take their report? We know that they all work together, but to say that literally he's still on the routes of doing things from 2015 to 2020, you didn't even stop after murdering my brother. You had a record leading up to the brutal murder of one unarmed man, Tyrone West, but the fact that didn't slow you down. He's a ticking time bomb. But again, until we hold these ticking time bombs accountable, no one is safe. No one is safe. And until we hold Ruiz accountable, we're going to keep on having brutal murders, all type of stuff, and no one is safe. And for David Lewis, an officer from Morgan State University, a 320-pound officer, as my brother was hogtied in a hogtie position, laying face down on the ground, screaming for his life, gasping like a fish, witnesses said. He decided he wanted to put his knee in my brother's back, one foot on his neck, until my brother was dead for over 5 minutes. You beat an unarmed man, 11 to 15 officers for 18 minutes, and then you let a 320-pound man finish him off. Shame on the city. I have nothing but the crazy part. This is not a city thing. This is a worldwide thing. It's called legal live genocide. Until we hold these killer cops and place them in a cell block, we can have all the testimonies in the world. That's not going to bring our loved ones back. I don't care if it takes another 8 years, 20 years from now. I'm never going to stop until these killer cops be held accountable. And we done did things like in my city, we done sponsored something called the gag order bill. Basically what happens, they mentioned the settlement that my family received, but unfortunately I had to take my name off because you're not going to craft my language and stop me from talking about my brother. I'm going to keep talking about my brother and making sure that my brother children, my beautiful niece and nephews and his grandchildren that he never got a chance to meet, I'm going to make sure that my whole family knows that I love and care about Tyrone West and that Tyrone West life mattered. They love and care about him so much, but they're still traumatized and they can't fight like I can fight. This is too traumatizing. But as long as I have breath in my body, I'm going to do what's right. But like I said, we changed the law about the gag order law. That went in effect in 2020. And unfortunately, at the time, we had a man named Jack Young. He decided not to even sign the gag order, but he didn't veto it. So it went into law 2020, where so people can actually talk about their case without the money being an issue and without it being took back. So we did that. And then as far as the state's attorney, we had a state's attorney at the time, Greg Bernstein, who decided to not do anything. And I said, you know what? The same way you set my family's face and you laughed and you said, this is good for litigation. And I'm thinking about, who gives a damn about some money? You couldn't write a check fat enough to cover up your bloody murder. You couldn't. I don't care if you gave us all the money in the world. It would not be equivalent to my brother's life or any of these brothers and sisters and mothers and daughters around the world lives. So I said all that to say, we did that and we got Greg Bernstein kicked out of office. We told no one never to vote for him. I literally, every time he was campaigning, trying to get back in office, we shut Greg Bernstein down. And unfortunately, I feel ashamed because I actually pumped up Marilyn Mosley, who's our state's attorney. I actually pushed this woman into office, stood beside her for her to turn her back on my family and disrespect me in such a way is unspeakable. Like, before you got in the office, you promised me, and I'm not asking you to break the law, I'm not asking you to bend any rules, I'm asking you to be fair, transparent, and hold these killer cops in the cell block. We know that there's no statutation limit on murder. All you have to do with all the witnesses, what are you waiting for all the witnesses to die off? Like, that's what you're doing. Just like one of our brothers said, an injustice anywhere is an injustice everywhere. And when you delay or deny accountability, it straggles on and nobody gets held accountable. But I am going to say, we are more than hashtags and body bags. We're more than being 6 feet in the dirt and pictures and buttons on t-shirts. Our lives matter. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioners, we're at about, thank you very much, Ms. Jones, for your powerful testimony, and we want to extend our deepest condolences for the loss of your brother. And we stand with you in your demand for accountability, and we hope that these hearings will push us further toward that direction. Commissioners, as I said, we're at about 10:34, so we have about 15 to 20 minutes left in the hearing. Ms. Gyamfi, I know that you wanted to say a few words. Do you still wish to speak, or would you like to go into question and answer?
I'd like to say just a few words. Oh, can you hear me?
Go ahead. Go ahead. Yes, go ahead.
I'd like to say just a few words, and thank you again so much, Ms. Jones, for your testimony in terms of the impact in your family and the things that your family has done to push back and get accountability. Just wanted to point out 4 pieces of, or 4 issues of accountability and impunity that come out in this case that I think are really important. One being, of course, the history of complaints and violence and corruption that remains unabated in Baltimore and in Maryland. As was brought up earlier, Officer Bernandez-Ruiz has had himself 18 complaints. And these are people who were brave enough to come forward. And yet there was no discipline. In fact, he was promoted to sergeant. And when this complaint was filed on behalf of Mr. West in the civil lawsuit, some of the allegations about prior acts and prior complaints against Mr. Ruiz were included in the lawsuit and it was made clear that the city had evidence. There was internal affairs complaints that were made, and the families never told about what happens with internal affairs. That is a problem, not just in Baltimore and Maryland, but all over the country, where complaints against police officers are considered personnel matters. They're considered employment matters and not the public safety matters that they actually are. That needs to change. Also, looking at the lack of medical assistance. This has been a recurring theme, not just in the hearings that we've had here in the commission, but also in general in this type of these cases and this type of litigation, where we find again and again that witnesses say victims are left to die, that the police are treated by medical assistance before the victims. And in this case, the only reason the ambulance was even dispatched was because of a call about an injured officer. And so I think that's an important point to make, and that comes out in this case. The blaming of the victim for his own death at the hands of police. As Ms. Jones pointed out, Mr. West had a clean bill of health. He was in good physical shape. And an interesting piece that Ms. Jones didn't go into, but I think is really important, is that Ms. Jones ended up getting a private medical exam. So the examiner in Maryland determined that he couldn't figure out what the cause of death was, and that there was something related to Mr. West having a heart attack or having some heart problem and dehydration as a result of the restraint. Ms. Jones looked at and saw an article in which a mother had gone back and exhumed the body of her daughter in order to prove that her daughter was in fact killed. And upon seeing that article, Ms. Jones made the determination that she would do the same thing for her brother, even though it was years later. She took $50,000 out of her own money, which she had to pull together by hook and crook. Ms. Jones is not living and drowning in money. She took $50,000 out of her own money, and she got a independent coroner in Texas, flew the body, her brother's body, to Texas to get that report. And that report showed that in fact the police were responsible, that Mr. West did not die because he was in poor physical health. And it's as a result of that report that the city and the state actually made the offer, because at that point it was clear that they were not going to be able to get away with saying that this was Mr. West's fault. Another piece that I'd like to bring up with respect to the coroner allowed the officers to be in the room when the autopsy was done. In fact, the detective spoke to Ms. Jones and told her before the autopsy even happened, you know what, the coroner's gonna find out that he had a heart problem and probably was dehydrated. And lo and behold, the coroner found out, quote unquote, that he had a heart problem and was more than likely dehydrated. And what was so unsettling to find out is that that is perfectly legal in Maryland and in so many other states, to have officers there present at the autopsy, even as the autopsy is determining whether or not the police are the ones that killed the person. So it's not surprising that it came to that conclusion. And we need to look into the cozy relationship between coroners and police, particularly when those coroners are doing autopsies in these types of cases. And then finally, I'd like to talk about the issue of the Gun Trace Task Force. The Gun Trace Task Force is the type of specialized unit that was created and as part of the war on drugs that it was alleged to be happening across this country, which we know was really a war on Black people. And those types of task force exist from coast to coast and all areas in between. And in spite of the complaints that happen again and again that are levied against these task force officers, these task forces continue to promulgate. So I wanted to just make sure to raise up those issues, some of which you heard earlier, but some of which you did not have the opportunity to hear. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioners, we have about 10 minutes remaining, so I'll turn it over to you to ask any questions that you may have for our witnesses.
Ms. Jones, I would like to join with Professor Ocen in offering you my deepest sympathy on the awful killing of your brother. I wanted also to commend you on your fight and your persistence and bravery in carrying on this fight for justice for your brother, but racial justice, to bring an end to these police killings of Black people in the United States of America. I was struck by your testimony that there are ticking time bombs in the force, as you put it, in the police force. And until these are eradicated, you will still have these killings by policemen. I wanted to ask you, how can one stop this cozy relationship between prosecutors and medical examiners and the police department? That's one of my questions. How can you have more independence of each of these important mechanisms in bringing about accountability? The other question I wanted to ask was, how can a police officer like Ruiz, with all these complaints of violence, continue in the force and is promoted? So what is it in the system that is not being done or is being done that can condone this sort of behavior? Why isn't he fired? Why isn't there somebody, some complaint review body that can stop him somewhere along the line? So those are my two key questions. We don't have a lot of time, so I'll stop there.
Ms. Jones, feel free to respond, and Ms. Gyamfi, if you want to add anything. Ms. Jones.
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Nana, first of all, for presenting those other facts. This is so much, but I definitely thank you for presenting those other facts that I didn't bring up. It's so much. I got a whole book here, right? But anyway, those were great questions. So to me, like, until you have like a real civilian review board that consists of people such as myself, like not ran by the police, that can actually look into this and set on a board aside and say, you know what? How in the world is Ruiz? And by the way, Ruiz just married a state's prosecutor named Michelle Battles. They're all in the bed together. They need to get out the bed together. That's what they need to do first. But nevertheless, you know, once we see that type of stuff, it should be enough to have a real civilian review board to say, you know what, that's not right. And whatever our findings are, let it not be watered down, because we had the city solicitor, Andre Davis. I call this guy the Wizard of Oz, but he would water down everything. Like, he would silence them when they would be on the right path. So if we were able to have our voices heard and actually hold these killer cops in the cell blocks, that's the only choice. And to me, the system is doing what it's designed to do. Unfortunately, you know, we were slaves. And police officers, the origin of policing, they were slave catchers. You get what I'm saying? And they're still basically living that same kind of way. And I urge everybody to real quick to look up the Casual Killing Act. And it basically talked about when, you know, the slave owners would say that the slaves were resisting, they could actually kill them. That's the same thing these killer cops are doing. So thank you, great question.
On the first issue, and thank you, Ms. Jones, and thank you, Commissioner, for the question. On the first issue, there has to be, and we see these efforts in terms of criminal justice reform in various cities, but there has to be a way in which when the police kill, that the public coroner is not the one that does the investigation. There needs to be an independent investigation that is done outside of that jurisdiction, but the investigation still needs to be paid for by the state, right? Or by some other means. Because what happens is, in Ms. Jones' case, she had to pull from here and there to be able to get the funds to be able to do this. Often it doesn't happen. And you'll see people doing GoFundMes or other crowdsourcing ways of getting money in order to cover the cost of independent investigation, because it's common knowledge to those of us that do this work, whether it's as organizers or as attorneys, which I happen to be both. It's common knowledge that, hey, these cases, if you don't have a private coroner, you may not get to the root of really what has happened. And so that needs to occur. And there are many that have argued that are not necessarily abolitionists, which I happen to be one, but outside of abolition and really getting rid of police altogether, there are some who have argued that we should have independent prosecutors that are dealing with the police that are in police cases in which police are accused of murdering citizens. And so it shouldn't be something that the regular prosecutors that need their assistance in order to pursue cases, they should not be the ones also looking into the police. And those are just a couple of the ideas that people have come up with and tried to implement with respect to breaking up some of this cozy relationship.
Thank you. And we have about 4 more minutes. So I think that means we have enough time for about one more question and very brief responses. So either Commissioner Uwaifo, would you like to ask a question?
Yes, thank you very much. I join Commissioner Clare and the inquiry commissioners across board to sympathize with you on the death of your brother. But I'm a bit worried, Attorney Nana and Chris Lawrence. We have probably from what I hear, I come from what they call developing country, Nigeria. You know, we have all hear about the best human rights organizations coming from the United States, the best bar associations are making bites like an octopus all over the world and all that. Now here we have fraudulent autopsy reports, fraudulent police investigations. We have police who refuse to aid victims, you know, even when they are the ones who brutalize who are killing the victims, and they also block citizens from coming to the aid of those victims they have brutalized or they are about to murder. And then we have all these kinds of total chaotic situation that we've seen throughout this inquiry. Now my question is, this American Bar Association, these state bars, these so-called human rights organizations that are all over the United States, that are all over the world, that make noise all over the place, are they not able, can we not see, or are they not able to come together to put an end to this rather seeming chaotic injustice? I'm just a bit worried because if you cannot heal yourselves in the United States, I wonder, you know, why it is so important that you should heal so many parts of the world with the kinds of quality of arguments and quality of literatures you bring to that part. I just want to know, what is the problem? The bar cannot talk. The judges are meant to be lawyers. Now judges give the fraudulent judgments. From what I see, I mean, jaundice judgments against citizens that they are meant to protect. So what's the bar doing? What are the state bars, the national bars, and the organization? What are they doing? I'm sorry, I just thought the lawyers would be able to give us some insight into this. Thank you.
I think probably the best person to answer that would be Attorney Gyamfi.
Yes, thank you. And I'll answer as quickly as I can because I know that we are running out of time. What we're doing here with this commission, the National Conference of Black Lawyers, the International Association of Democratic Lawyers, the National Lawyers Guild, this is a big piece of what the lawyers are doing, what the state bars are doing. This is an example of something that we're attempting that we're doing to bring light to what is going on, to have the commissioners, listen to the families and to attorneys about what is happening, to get this report together with the assistance of the rapporteurs and commissioners, and to make sure that the UN not only looks at this issue, but that they also take up this charge, specifically looking at what is happening to people of African descent in the United States. There's a lot of organizing that is going on here with some of the very organizations, Commissioner Uwaifo, that you refer to, that are coming together along with organizers on the ground, activists on the ground, people in Black Lives Matter, people like Colette Flanagan with Mothers Against Police Brutality. There are many who are actually doing the work in connection with other bar associations such as the National Conference of Black Lawyers to push back in the very cities that things are happening, in the very states where we see these problems occurring. But certainly, we are looking forward to the report, to the recommendations, to the findings and conclusions that come out of this commission as a major historic piece, as a major movement piece, and as a major proactive action that is going to allow and force the United States to address this issue at this critical time? So thank you for that question.
Thank you very much, Ms. Gyamfi, for that response. And I think, unfortunately, that will have to be our last question as we are out of time. So this will conclude the hearing in the case of Tyrone West. Want to extend our deepest gratitude and condolences to Ms. Jones, who joined us today, and our other witnesses, Ms. Gyamfi, Mr. Lawrence, Ms. Smith. Thank you for your testimony. We will now have a short break for about 8 minutes. We will resume at 8 a.m. Pacific, 11 a.m. Eastern. So again, thank you all for attending. This will conclude the hearing in the matter of the murder of Tyrone West.